which was coming back from Vietnam. It was principally against marijuana at that time, and the reason was because it was a way to criminalise the youth movement. It was also a way to criminalise the Black Panther Party, and also specifically to persecute blacks and Mexicans with some degree of legitimacy, because, as I say, they were considered, that's where a lot of the marijuana came from, particularly into California and such like that at the time. Similarly, the 1982 Reagan war on drugs was not actually based on crime or rising levels of criminality, but was actually biased against black communities. It was launched in a response to racial politics, not increasing levels of drug addiction. The war on drugs in 1982 was actually part of the Republican Party's Southern policy. Now, the Southern policy was a marketing campaign that was arranged to appeal to poor white voters, particularly in southern states that actually that were threatened by civil rights. And so the Reagan administration actually paid news agencies and advertising companies to focus on the urban inner city, black neighborhoods, black drug dealers, black users, and to hype the supposed epidemic of crack babies. And this policy was basically used to swing the votes of certain Democrats towards the Republicans by putting a racial spin on the situation, basically stereotyping crime and drug crime as specifically a black problem that only the Republicans would be brave enough to deal with.
So somewhere like Harlem, Neil, that has had drug problems,
yeah,
you think that's all been engineered then? Is that what you're saying?
I do, particularly Harlem. I mean,
how is it engineered? What is it? Not just people who've got nothing to do and they want to experiment with drugs, and then they tell their friends, and then it all pans out like that, and then the government try and combat it.
Well, where did the drugs come from in the first place? Now, particularly with Harlem. Now, prior to Harlem, basically, there's something that's connected with Cuba and the Mafia, because the Mafia seemed to be the conduit by which the CIA managed to flood America with drugs, particularly in the 1960s. I mean, the Mafia were basically, they don't deal drugs themselves. To get people like, two famous examples would be J. Sebring was dealing to the Hollywood crowd, and sometimes a gentleman called Charles Manson would also deal drugs for them as well. But the point is that in areas like Harlem, they had a gentleman called Frank Lucas. Now, initially, he was with Bumpy Johnson, and they were being basically supplied with the drugs by the Mafia, who were getting it from the French Connection. You may know that there's the film The French Connection, and that's where they were getting it from. What he managed to do was he managed to undercut the Mafia by getting it directly from the Golden Triangle. Now, how he managed to do this was he had a cousin, or someone who married his cousin, a Master Sergeant called Leslie Ike Atkinson, who was also better known as Sergeant Smack within the DEA and various other circles. What they did was they got the heroin directly from the Golden Triangle and managed to ship it back to America in the coffins, some say in the body cavities of dead American soldiers, and this came to be known as the cadaver connection. Mm-hmm. The suggestion is that basically the CIA, DA and various other people allowed for this to happen. In fact, when Frank Lucas was actually apprehended many years later, somehow by turning informant he managed to reduce a 70-year sentence to just 2 years. That's right. Pretty impressive.
Alright, so the DEA, that's the Drug Enforcement Agency, you think were allowing certain major mass transportations of drugs into America?
Oh, I know they were.
And for what purpose, Neil?
Well, I mean, in that particular instance, I mean, one of his business partners was Melvin Combs, who's Sean Puffy Combs, or Puff Daddy's father. The reason that I would suggest that they were doing that is to gentrify a population. What you can do is you can run down and economically ruin an entire city or an entire area, which then leaves abandoned neighbourhoods and run down buildings. Corporate interests can come in, they can buy up the land for a greatly reduced price, and then they can put in things like condominiums. For example, recently in Harlem they had what was called the Harlem Renaissance, which is great apparently because Harlem's now got all these fabulous wealthy businesses and places to live and such like that, but the people who originally lived there have to move away. They have to move away. Are the CIA involved in drugs? Well, Michael Levine, a former DEA agent, said the CIA is the kingpin of the drugs game.
All right, well, let's just comment on something in now, because you're talking about the 1980s era. You told me what the nickname for Chicago currently is.
Yeah, Chirac.
Chirac.
Yeah, because he's got a higher death rate than Iraq. Like
and why is that?
Because basically you've got lots of gangs of young kids who are selling drugs and fighting each other for turf. Now, the reason that Chicago is so particularly plagued with drugs is to do with Mexican cartels, particularly the Sinaloa cartel. Sinaloa cartel was run by a gentleman called Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, or El Chapo, which means Shorty, it's his nickname. It was provably financed by the CIA. To allow, and the ATF, which allowed the constant flow from I think of about 2001 to about 2009 of drugs into Chicago. At one point the Sinaloa cartel was actually providing 90% of all drugs in Chicago, which gives you a perfect example of how these social situations can create such chaos. In a few years' time they'll sweep in and Chicago will be made into a very, very nice place to live, moving these people and basically, for want of a better phrase, letting them kill each other.
So you contend then that the CIA, if it wanted to, it could stop the flow of drugs and end a lot of this gun crime, is it? If it wanted to.
I think that drugs are used.
But it allows it to happen.
Yeah, I think that drugs are used alongside what is publicly perceived as criminal organisations, and it serves a lot of functions. It allows people to basically become lotus eaters, which basically means that they're not going to get involved with politics. It criminalises whole sections, and it causes chaos. It causes these own little sort of economic systems within cities. And then you can go further than that. It gives the government the perfect excuse to crack down on people. And this is before we've even get into the concept of the prison industrial complex, which is basically the use of drugs and harsh drug penalties, plea bargains, 3 strikes laws and such like that, to basically provide a prison population. What is the prison population? It's slave labour force for private owned companies like CCA, which was formerly known as WAC.
You used a term there, Neil, that I haven't heard before. Lotus eaters. What's that mean?
Lotus eaters is from, I think it's from the Iliad. It's the concept that you just sit there and do nothing. The drugs overtake you and you're completely separate, or you've turned on and dropped out, as Timothy Leary might say.
So within government, shall we say, there is a concern that people might use their intellect to challenge what they're up to, policies and this kind of thing, in a genuine way, not in a yah-boo type way, but in order to stifle that, you think that the drug running, which has been run by the CIA, is all part of that. Part of the dumbing down of society as a whole.
And it can work on several ways. It can just demonise a population by making that association. It can give you physically stop you from getting involved, because if you're like this, then suddenly you don't feel like going and protesting or whatever. Or alternatively, what it can do is it can, as I say, demonise you in the eyes of the mainstream public. If you've got a criminal record, you're not going to be taken seriously. If you have a very salient point, regardless of how intellectually sound it is, if people can turn around and use your drug use as a bat to knock you down, and then basically make your point less legitimate in the eyes of the wider world.
Welcome back. I'm talking to Neil Sanders about how drugs are used, he would allege, to control society. Now, if we just take a step back from it for a moment, Neil, and consider what drugs are. A lot of them grow naturally on the planet, and this was a point that Bill Hicks used to make.
Why is marijuana against the law? It grows naturally upon our planet. Doesn't the idea of making nature against the law seem to you a bit paranoid? To make marijuana against the law is like saying God made a mistake.
You know, we've got alcohol, which is allowed. We've got tobacco, which is allowed, both which are naturally occurring, and then we've got some drugs which are naturally occurring which aren't allowed. So we've got a whole array of different chemicals we can put in our bodies that our governments have decided that those ones are bad, you're not going to use those. These ones are allowed. The ones that are allowed, you think, are kind of pacifying the public in a way, like alcohol and tobacco. They're not really going to stimulate people mentally, whereas other drugs might.
Yes, yes, to an extent. However, I'm not one of these people that go for the sort of, you take acid once and suddenly you become enlightened and stuff like that. I know a lot of people that have taken a lot of acid, and a lot of them were pricks before they took it, and they're still like that afterwards. So, you know, it's not drugs per se, it's a substance. They're not an immediate channel into, you know,
higher consciousness.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that would do that. I have no problem with them, but I don't think that they're basically, You know?
Some people will contend that sort of Terence McKenna, for example, yeah, he would say that he has had altered states of consciousness which could not be achieved without the use of narcotics.
Yeah, he's absolutely right.
And that they were real experiences. They weren't hallucinations, or he was connecting to something which he couldn't reach otherwise. This kind of thing.
Yeah, very
you go
possibly.
along with that?
Yeah, with some things, but I think it very much depends on the person, the drug, and the scenario. I don't think there is a go-to. As I say, I don't think LSD is the path to enlightenment for everybody. I don't think that. But in the same way that some people are fine on a couple of drinks, some people turn into raging, bores, basically.
So just to ask your opinion on this, then, would you legalise all drugs and then just tax them a bit, or what would you do? Because I think I would be of that mind.
Yeah, I would be of that mind.
Who is a government to tell you what you can and can't do to your own body? That's the way I would look at it.
Yeah, I'd look at it like that as well, but also purely because. Not because I feel that there's any sort of like transcendental sort of enlightenment path for humanity on a whole, although I feel that can happen, but purely because the whole point of drugs is for this social control, and the circumstances exist where people feel that they want to use these sorts of things. Like people say, you know what, if you didn't want to get arrested for drugs, don't take drugs. And so you're absolutely right. I wish I was as happy as you. I wish I wasn't in the circumstances whereby you felt, because a lot of people do. People don't do it just to spite everybody else. They do it either because it's fun or because they feel that they wish to have an escape from the broader social conditions. If everybody was 100% happy, there would be no need for escape, would there? But that's too broad. We don't want to talk about that. Let's just blame them for shoving that stuff in their veins and put them in prison.
But to get back onto the point that you're making, and that is that I often think of government as having two arms. The visible government, the Obama, the Cameron that we see, and then there's the hidden. It's a bit like the jab and the right hook.
Absolutely, it's a problem. It's a created problem that's created by the governments as a distraction, as a sluice. Basically, this is a way of blaming all your ills on society. I mean, it's tied in basically with the concept of the prison industrial complex. The prison industrial complex is a system situated at the intersection of government and private interests. It uses prisons as a solution to social, political, and economic problems. It includes human rights violations, slave labour, policing, courts, the media, and the elimination of dissent. And one of the tools that is used in this system, this perpetuated system, is the flooding of particularly poor areas with drugs. And then again, look at the sort of
because
response.
And just to interrupt you there, and you're saying it's because they're not doing anything of any great use. People who live in certain areas, or that is how the officialdom would see them. Let's get them in prison and they can make circuit boards for Lockheed Martin.
Exactly. Once you're in prison.
But do you know if that happens in the UK, Neil?
Well, I don't know if it is.
Are people doing jobs in
Yeah,
prisons?
people do jobs in prisons, and they're all privately owned. I don't know specifically what it is. I know that in America they've got contracts with places like Lockheed Martin and Boeing. And I know that they make army military uniforms and bulletproof vests. And so this is the strange thing. So the prison industrial complex is this huge industry. So it's politically beneficial for you to have a prison because basically you're driving down unemployment, you're seen as being hard on crime, you're getting all these different disparate industries that are coming in and sort of spreading out like a spider's web. And you're showing that you're a good corporate citizen.
We've got Group 4 in the UK. They seem to be running a lot of this private security. And are they running prisons?
They run in prisons, they run in airport security, they also run certain power grids as well. They're one of these, and Leicester Police Force, I believe, they've got a hand in as well. But yes, this is the point. This is a private industry that says that it's doing a public service, and in actual fact what it's doing is it's utilising these people, providing this military industrial complex with a workforce that they don't have to pay taxes on. It's essentially like a slave labour. Also, look at the way that they treat poor people as the way as opposed to the way that they treat somebody like a celebrity, like Nigella Lawson's doing cocaine or something like that. But it's all right, we understand that. But if some sort of
did Nigella Lawson do cocaine?
Yeah, she did it. She admitted to it. But basically, it was just because she was upset. So perfectly legitimate. I mean, you could make the argument that that lad that was, you know,
maybe she put it in one of her pies.
Well, maybe she did. Maybe you could make the same argument that that poor lad that's doing it, he's just doing it because he's upset as well. But no, that's all right because, you know, it's framed in a particularly different way.
See, I think a lot of people, Neil, would say, well, it's against the law, therefore they need to be punished. They need to be put in prison. But you would say
I would say that it's not equal across the board. I'd suggest, depending on your position in society, whether you're a celebrity or a politician or whatever, then why is George Bush not in prison? George Bush is an admitted ex-cocaine addict.
And the other thing that you would contend is that particularly the CIA are fueling the drug use. But would you say it's the same in the UK? I've recently spoken to a chap whose son, well, he alleges was murdered, and he's in trying to get justice for his son. He's uncovered the murders of 5 other young men who were sort of on the fringes or knew about certain drug crime in London. Now, it appears from that there are a lot of corrupt police officers in the UK who are profiting from drug crime in the UK, and that goes to a very high level within the British police force, perhaps to Deputy Chief Constable, he alleges. So, but do you think it goes right to the top, or do you think it's just the fact that the drug lords have compromised a large number of police officers?
I know that Howard Marks, who was a marijuana importer, had a lot of connections with MI5, MI6, the Mafia and certain other terrorist organisations, which seems very, very strange. But the point is that basically the drugs often come from a war scenario, Vietnam War, increase in Golden Triangle, increase in heroin in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
To use a quote from a film, ain't no poppy fields in Harlem. Nobody in South Central owns a plane. Nobody, you know, they don't have these huge amounts of infrastructure. You could look at other.
So it's got to get there somehow.
Yeah.
And to get it there requires quite a comprehensive logistical operation.
Yeah.
All right. So let's come on to the Iran-Contra, because that fits in nicely with this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this was a war between Iran and Iraq.
Yes.
Just take it from there, Neil.
Well, that was basically, I mean, Iran and Iraq were fighting, and basically there was a weapons embargo against Iran, so it was illegal to sell the weapons. But Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and through a conduit called Oliver North, them and certain members of the Israeli government decided that they wanted to actually supply Iran with weapons.
So who's imposed the ban on weapon sales to Iran?
I think it was an international arms embargo.
So maybe UN or something like that.
Yeah, violations.
But were the US supplying weapons to Iraq at that time?
Oh yes, absolutely. You know,
weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. We like to provide both sides of a war with, and
as they do. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
the idea was this: the legitimizing of it was that they were only supplying Iran with weapons so that this money could be used in order to finance the Contras who were fighting the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Somehow in all of this, as well as providing them with weapons and stuff like that, the Sandinistas decided very, very kindly to provide tons and tons and tons of cocaine, which went into America. This went through conduits, particularly Danilo Blandon, who was connected to the Nicaraguan government. It went through Panama under CIA asset Manuel Noriega, through the Guadalajara cartel, which was financed and set up by the CIA and at the time was the largest Mexican cartel, and then to people like Ricky Ross, which was then turned into crack and distributed in Ohio, St. Louis and Los Angeles. By strange coincidence, Compton and South Central Los Angeles has also been gentrified in the same way that Harlem has. So now it's actually a very, very, pricey place to live.
So just the result of exporting arms to that conflict was to get a whole load of drugs back into the US.
Yes, which just so happened to be turned into crack and sold to specifically black people, which just so happened to coincide with the Republican Southern policy, which was demonising blacks in order to swing votes towards their
right.
party.
All right, let's come on to Danilo Blandon, is it?
Yeah.
Tell us about him.
Well, Danilo Blandon, he was basically initially headed Nicaragua's agricultural imports under Somoza, but in 1979 he fled to the US. He was a CIA asset, but he was basically protected by the CIA when he was funneling money and weapons to the Contras from the profits that were made with Freeway Ricky Ross and the Crips street gang in Los Angeles. And for example, he was arrested in 1986, but by 1982, for drugs peddling, all charges were dropped. He eventually became. He was a naturalised citizen. The INS, despite his criminal conviction, actually gave him an American passport and set him up. He now works for the DEA, for the Drugs Enforcement Agency, on a $42,000 a year job. But
Right.
he was the guy that was basically, say, the conduit to get the drugs to Freeway Ricky Ross. He was also the person who would phone up and say, "Move your stash from here, here, and here. There's going to be an investigation of that."
Right, and I have heard that happens in London as well.
Oh,
and,
no,
and,
I don't doubt it.
To the point where they've got the kettle on
For the police.
for the people who are going to raid the place. Welcome back. I'm Richard D. Hall, and I'm talking to Neil Sanders about how drugs are used to control society. And I mentioned Bill Clinton before the break there. Now, I read in one of David Icke's books that Bill Clinton was running the Mina airstrip in his constituency and was allegedly importing large quantities of drugs in aeroplanes that were coming in. I mean, is there any truth to that, Neil?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, basically, he wasn't running it per se. He was just the governor of the state when it was going on. It was run by a gentleman called Barry Seal, who was a CIA contract air pilot since the mid-50s. And basically, he had a very colourful career. Going backwards and forwards to South. He's actually South America. He's actually played by Dennis Hopper in a film. I forget the name of the film. He's a strange one, Barry Seal. Apparently, he was friends with David Ferry and Clay Shaw, who were involved with the JFK assassination. And allegedly, he was in Dallas, Texas on the day and left in a plane, a Cessna or something, a small airplane, very, very shortly after JFK was assassinated.
Right.
But I don't know.
Now, so how do we know that Bill Clinton had knowledge of the Mina airstrip drug
because
operation?
Barry Seal had actually previously tried to set up this airstrip, he was dealing cocaine for the Medellin, which is basically run by Pablo Escobar for a time. The Medellin this cocaine would eventually end up in South Central in the hands of Michael Harris, or Harry-O, who was one of the principal founders of Death Row Records. Again, another way to demonise young black youth. He tried to set it up in Louisiana, and Louisiana says, "No chance, you're not doing that. You're not bringing drugs into our state." Mina said, "Yeah, perfectly. That's perfectly legitimate." And so this is where he was. I mean, he was trained at...
So has he made confessions about all this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So where's he now then?
He's dead. He was murdered. Well, what happened was basically he got caught many times with large shipments of cocaine. Sometimes it went missing. Sometimes he got short sentences. Sometimes he miraculously got away with it. He was running cocaine off the back of the Iran-Contra thing, but sometimes from the Medellin as well, into America, and then it was distributed